we work into the conclusion of Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad this week, and we follow Cora's journey west and north. And there's a wide range of kinds of things you can analyze from this. Particularly interesting is the sense of African American history in the United States that comes out in the Indiana chapter as you kind of rethink Cora's journey and her place there on the Valentine farm. How the impulses of those who've gathered at the farm, who have escaped from slavery or who are freed persons who have come west to Indiana, how their thoughts and the kinds of conflicts and discussions there reflect African American history. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was trying to think about what is the African American's place within American culture and society, and how does the leadership of African Americans work in the early 20th century. Du Bois was setting up his thoughts against Booker T. Washington, who had a very different sense of how African Americans fitted within American culture as the 20th century progressed. You also have very interesting kinds of African American histories that are here. Spaces like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and its Black Wall Street, which was a center of African American finance in the early 20th century, and the Oklahoma itself became a space that many African Americans moved to escape the violence in the American South, and to escape the impending violence and the kinds of degradations that were present in lives in the industrial North. So those kinds of stories and histories are engaged by the last half of Whitehead's novel. Early on in this last half, Whitehead kind of returns to those questions of the economics of slavery. Cora comes to understand, her place within a larger economic engine. In North Carolina, Martin, the man who's protecting her, explains to her what he calls the ruthless engine of cotton and its fuel of black bodies. And so he kind of lays bare for her, that slavery is at the heart of this kind of economic engine that is about producing cotton and producing wealth in the Americas. Personally, this comes face to face with Cora on her flight from North Carolina, and she's abducted again by Ridgway, the slave catcher, and Ridgway carries with him a ledger of slaves, of the accounts that he's settled and the slaves that he's returned and how much he's received for them. On 219, as it describes this ledger, list upon list crowded the ledger of slavery, the names gathered first on the African coast, and tens of thousands of manifests that human cargo. The names of the dead were as important as the names of the living, as every loss from disease and suicide and the other mishaps labeled as such for accounting purposes needed to be justified to employers. At the auction block, they tallied the souls purchased at each auction, and on the plantations the overseers preserved the names of workers in rows of tight cursive, every name an asset, breathing capital, profit made flesh. So Cora comes face to face here, and you as a reader come face to face with the realities of cotton, and the economic effects it has upon the nation and the region of the South in particular, but the North too. The sense in which where that cotton went, and how it became wealth for others. That Cora's story is told within that larger economic story. Ridgway himself kind of situates, that story within a larger story, as he says in page 226, the American spirit. Ridgway here will say, that all these years later, I prefer the American spirit to conquer and build and civilize. Our destiny by divine prescription, the American imperative. That sense that of manifest destiny in terms of territory, but also in terms of economics as well, right? That sense that that the United States is here to, as he says, conquer and build and civilize, and if not to civilize, to as he says on 226, to exterminate anyone that gets in the way of that. The Valentine Farm in Indiana offers an interesting space, as I said above, in terms of how it situates basic kinds of arguments and conflicts in African American history and African American discussion in the early 20th century, but the kinds of questions that were at the roots, of African American experience from the very beginning in the Americas. The Valentine Farm is started by a man who sets up a motto from the very beginning, which is stay and contribute. So it's a larger kind of communal space that escaped slaves have come to kind of rebuild and rethink their lives and to live in community. Of course, this is set up against the kind of really stark national realities of the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave owners to go over the boundary of slavery at that point, mainly defined by the Ohio River, to reclaim their possession, the slave himself or herself. As Valentine notes, himself, that Indiana was a slave state and that evil soaks into the soil. So, as wonderful as the Valentine Farm seems, you have this impending sense of danger even there, that Escape North does not necessarily offer freedom in the end to Cora and to the other escaped slaves. The Valentine Farm, in its wide-ranging kind of community building, was something that was beyond Cora's imagination as she kind of thinks about it. Valentine will describe it himself in 251 as perhaps the advance guard of a great migration from the South, and this kind of harbingers the millions who come north from the South to northern factories early into the mid-20th century. Against that sense of migration and change, Lander offers his own understanding of slavery in context of the nation's history. He'll say, as they're debating of whether to stay at the farm or not, here's one delusion. He says that we can escape slavery. And so he's thinking about the idea that slavery is always a part of the legacy of who the escaped slave is, that slavery has left its mark, has left its traumatic mark on the slave, on the escaped slave, and in some ways on the freed person as well. So the Valentine Farm, the kind of basic argument that's going on in the Indiana chapter is the question of whether or not these freed persons and escaped slaves have reached the end of their journey in the community of the Valentine Farm, or whether they should go further west, as some did, to Oklahoma or to the northern plains to farm or to find their fortune there, or perhaps even further north into Canada, or whether they should just try to stay north and build a life there in Indiana, or as many did in the northern industrial cities that developed in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And you have Mingo here as kind of a figure who is advocating staying north, but he recognizes the divisions that are already present among African Americans, particularly as he notices the traumatic effects of slavery and how it has marked the psychic landscapes of many escaped slaves. And so whether or not you go west or whether you stay north is a debate that reflects African American culture in the late 19th, early 20th century that Whitehead is picking up on here in the novel. And of course, in the middle of all this is the central kind of narrative of Cora's journey. How do you understand that journey in the end? Is it one of escape and freedom, or is it one of kind of perpetual flight? In the end, is this a novel that resolves itself, with a happy ending of Cora finding freedom, or is it more unresolved in the end, that where she sees flight as the as the one true reality for the escaped slave? She comes face to face with this when Royal takes her to what is called the Ghost Tunnel on pages 251 and following in the novel. And there's a moment here where as she thinks about her own journey and kind of looks into this space of the tunnel, which is somehow a part of the Underground Railroad here north. She thinks on page 263, a notion crept over her like a shadow that this station was not the start of the line but its terminus, Construction hadn't started beneath the house, but at the other end of the black hole, as if in the world there were no places to escape to, only places to flee. In the cellar above, the scavengers roused to activity, scraping such a dank little hole. Any trip with this point of origin could only be ill-fated. The last time she'd been in one of the railroad's departure stations had been brightly lit, generous in its comforts, and had delivered her to the bounty of Valentine. That was in Tennessee, when they waited to be carried away from the dangerous escapade with Ridgway. The events of that night still made her heart quicken. So does Cora ever find herself in a place of freedom? In what ways does the Underground Railroad, this seemingly small, dank end of the tunnel, in what ways does it offer a space of resolution? In the same way as the question is, does the North ever really offer a space of resolution to her, or does she feel it as one more stop? As the Valentine farm is attacked by slave catchers, later in the novel here, Cora will once again be thrown into movement. Is on page 309, she goes into Northness, right? She's on the run again. And even her last moment in the novel, her last thoughts in the novel, are a moment where she looks at an African American man that she, meets up with in her escape from Indiana, and she wonders where Ollie had escaped from, how far he'd traveled before he put it behind him. And so those traumas of the escaped slave's life still affect Cora in this journey. Do you read that as a moment of resolution wherein she as a character is changed and becomes resolved to become someone new? Or is it a moment of kind of irresolution where she dissolves within that story? How do you read Whitehead's novel here?